Both the Hebrew and the Greek scriptures were written in the midst of a world full of gods. Full of gods. This really, when I started to unpick and identify this little detail, this was a real key for me in understanding the context, not just of the Old Testament, but also the New Testament. So I want you to grab a hold of that little detail early on, okay? Exodus 15, verse 11, and I know we're going pre-Rome at this moment in time, but Exodus 15, verse 11 says, "Who is like you, Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, awesome in praises, doing wonders?" Moses, in that song, that statement, recognizes that there is a distinction between Adonai, the Lord God of Israel, and the gods, in this case of Egypt, but also of Canaan and of all the other nations that surrounds them. And there are many references throughout the scriptures to lots of so-called gods, okay? We know things like Baal, Asherah, Molech, and there are many more. I won't go into an exhaustive list right now. Are you with me so far? This is, yeah? Okay. Paul lived in a world full of gods. We've seen some references already, and his writings make specific references to gods with a small g, okay? Zeus, in Roman Jupiter, so Zeus in Greek, Roman Jupiter, they're exact counterparts, just in two different cultures. The king of the Olympian gods, the supreme deity in Greek and Roman religion, often referred to as the Father. The god of thunder and the cloud gatherer. He controlled the weather, offered signs and omens, and generally dispensed justice, guaranteeing order amongst both the gods and humanity from his seat on Mount Olympus. Okay, and Paul gets referred to as Zeus after the miracle in Ephesus, doesn't he? So, and that's recorded in Acts 14. Barnabas, at the same time, gets referred to as Hermes, which in Roman is the god Mercury. He was the ancient Greek god of trade, wealth, luck, fertility, sleep, language, thieves, and most recognizable, travel. Mercury is often associated with travel, isn't it? Artemis is referred to in the New Testament. The Roman goddess Diana and Artemis are one and the same. The daughter of Zeus and Leto, twin sister of Apollo, the goddess of chastity, hunting wild animals, forests, childbirth and fertility. And I've got about 5 different references, all in the book of Acts, all talking about Artemis. Okay. There are other allusions to gods in the New Testament. There's one called Asclepius, which I find very interesting. John chapter 5, you guys know this one about the pool at Bethesda, and Jesus coming to the lame guy saying, you know, do you really want to be healed? And there's this, depending on what version of the Bible you read, it talks about the fact that an angel of the Lord comes down and stirs up the water, and the fastest person in gets healed. Do you know what surprises me? That not more people ask questions about that scripture. Does it really sound like a work of the God that we know and we read about? That he's basically going to sort of play a little bit of roulette. He's going to send an angel down and then watch as all these cripples try to get into the water first, and only the first one gets in. You know, that entire passage, that whole thing, is based on an Asclepion temple in Jerusalem. Asclepius is the name of the goddess of healing. So the actual bit about the angel of the Lord coming down, that's an addition to the New Testament writings, and it's not found in the early manuscripts. It's an addition later by people who didn't understand the culture, the biblical culture, but did understand something of the Greek culture, and they inserted it later on. Anyway, that was off track a little bit. In Acts 28, this is an account of Paul's journey to Rome. After 3 months, we set sail on a ship from Alexandria that had wintered at the island, with the twin brothers as its figurehead. The twin brothers in Greek mythology are two guys called Castor and Pollux. Okay, twin sons of Zeus and Leda. They're made into a constellation known better as Gemini. So they're considered gods, again with a small g. Their chief interest was the safety of mariners, and they had apparently been granted divine power over the winds and the waves. Many ships of this era had ensigns or figureheads of them on their bow. Okay. Another reference to a god, small g within the New Testament, Hades. Now Hades is both a god and the underworld simultaneously. So Hades, first and foremost, is the name of a god, but the god who ruled over the underworld. So the name became synonymous with the place and the god itself. And if you look in the Greek, Hades is the name that is used throughout the Greek New Testament. When talking about, if you read it in something like my sort of slight Hebraic translation, it refers to Sheol, which is the Hebrew counterpart. The place of the dead. But if you're a Greek speaker in first century Rome and you're getting all this, there's an immediate association. Every time the word Hades is used, you don't think of it in terms of the Hebraic understanding of the place of the dead. You immediately associate it with your Greco-Roman, polytheistic worldview. You associate it with the place that Hades rules. The Roman version of Hades is Pluto. Jupiter, Pluto, Mercury, our planets are still named after them today. This is another inheritance we have from the Roman Empire. We're still living in the aftermath of the theology of the Roman Empire. There was no such thing as secular culture. That's one of the biggest things that we miss out on today. We perceive in our world today that there is a secular culture, i.e. a culture that doesn't believe in any kind of concept of God. That's not strictly true, is it? They believe they are God. Humanism, or as Chuck Cohen would say, humanism. It's about us being gods, isn't it? National identity and culture was defined by worship practices specific to each nation's deities. So each nation had associated gods. Okay? Family life, holy days, which animals were considered food or fit for sacrifice, the methods of animal slaughter, temple worship, was all built around the religious practices required by these gods. Okay? The sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations, rivers, and mountains were all attributed to different gods. All of them. Various forms of worship then reflected this. And so what would happen? Two armies fight each other, two national armies fight each other. The victors were those who were perceived to have the greater God on their side. Okay, so when Rome beat Greece or any of the other places, it was perceived that the Roman gods were the ones enabling the Roman army to win. Now, for pretty much every nation, they had a polytheistic worldview. And so in a world full of gods, you defeat another nation. It's not that yours is the true God and theirs is no God at all. It's just that yours is the stronger God and theirs is the weaker God, but still a God. Does that make sense? So it's not that theirs isn't a God, it's still a God. It's just not as strong as your God. You've got to be aware as well. I've identified 4 different types of person in Paul's world, the people that he was addressing. Now, you could break these down into subcategories within, but he's not talking to just Jew and Gentile. He's not talking to just Christian and Jew. It's not that straightforward, okay? You've got, within the Jewish community, you've got those who were messianic, believers in Jesus or Yeshua as Messiah. You've got those who weren't. So within the Jewish community itself, there's factions and different opinions, okay? But they were all still Jews. Within the Gentile world, you've got, I'm going to be very specific with my terminology here, you've got God-fearing Gentiles, and you've got everybody else. You've got those who worshipped all of the other pagan gods, deities, concepts, okay? Within the God-fearing Gentiles, you've then got those, by God-fearing, I'm talking about God with a capital G now, I'm talking about the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. Within the God-fearing Gentiles, then you've got those who eventually recognize Yeshua, Jesus, as the Messiah, and you've got those who maybe don't. But one of the things we've got to be absolutely clear about when we decipher Paul's letters is Paul doesn't consider Jews pagans. Even the ones that aren't messianic, he doesn't consider as pagans. The Jews are not a people without God. This is very, very important. The Jews, even the ones that didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah, were not pagans in Paul's eyes. They were not a people without God. Remember as well, Paul was a Jew. Paul, I don't think I have to convince anybody here, but Paul was a Jew of Jews, and he goes into all his credentials in the book of Philippians. Philippians 3:5, if you want to look at it, Paul goes into all his credentials about he is the Jew of all Jews. And I want you to also remember, Christianity in the first century looked nothing like it looks today. It's light years apart. Christianity in the first century was effectively a sect of Judaism. And Judaism looked nothing like it does today. Judaism in the first century wasn't really termed Judaism back then, except by those outside of Israel probably. Christianity was effectively a sect within Judaism. You know, the first so-called Christians were Jews. It was simply a messianic expression of Judaism itself. And then Gentile believers in this particular God, they started to look and express their faith in a way that resembled the Judaism of the first century, not what we see in Christianity today, which is very, very different. Absolutely important we get that. In a world full of gods, it was normal to celebrate festivals and make sacrificial offerings to a variety of different deities. It's not like you only worshipped one of them. At different times of year, you'd go into different temples and you'd celebrate and sacrifice to different types of gods, okay? That was quite normal. It wasn't perceived to be in conflict with anything else because, of course, the gods are all up there. They're all just in charge of different bits of the cosmos as far as anybody's concerned. The Roman Empire had conquered the vast majority of the known world, and with that had absorbed different people groups into her midst. Okay, even the Roman army was made up some of Spanish, some Germanic, some from, all over the place. It was a massive different people groups, and with those people groups, you got cultures of different kinds absorbed. This wasn't a problem for a polytheistic worldview. Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, and other, but those are sort of the four main ones for the purposes of what we're understanding, all have a polytheistic worldview. And when you've got, 12, 20, 30, 40, 50 gods in your worldview, adding a few more is not a problem. Especially, and I haven't got the time on this trip to go into this, especially when you parallel the origins and mythologies of all these nations and you see the clear similarities between them at their core. If we're talking about virgin births, we're talking about gods coming down to earth, we're talking about all these different things, and you can see the parallels between the Egyptian, the Roman, the Greek, the Babylonian, and the Babylonian charts right back to Nimrod, then it's actually not so hard to accept, okay, well, there's this virgin birth story here, so we can accept that from the Egyptians, because that just sounds exactly like this Greek one over here, which sounds like this Roman one over here. It's not an issue to absorb these concepts in. Before Rome was the dominant power, we've got the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Medo-Persians, and the Greeks. And this is a common thing. What would happen is as every new nation became the governing power, every nation that they conquered, they would then absorb their culture, some of it anyway, their theology and everything into their own. Now, the Greeks particularly, as everyone else, wanted to also impose culture, but as with everything, it's a two-way street, isn't it? The scripture talks about Jews not sitting down with Gentiles, in this case pagan worshippers. Don't even sit down and eat with these people, because when you spend enough time in the presence of somebody, you start to have a certain sympathy for their worldview, you start coming around to their way of thinking, all the rest of it. So if you're a nation absorbing other nations and cultures, it's inevitable, whether intentional or not, that you're going to eventually take on some of the culture, some of the ideology, theology, mythology, whatever it is. You're going to eventually absorb some of that into your own culture. It is inevitable. You can't not. Actually, I've got a biblical example here. Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 1 asking for Daniel and others to come and advise in the Babylonian courts about the language and the culture and the understanding of the Chaldeans. You know, there's a biblical example of exactly what I'm talking about happening. So the Babylonians then wanted to learn about the culture that they'd adapted and learn from their wisdom. And we get the Magi later on, don't we? These guys who'd continued down the generations after Daniel to be looking for the King of the Jews, which is why they then ended up at Yeshua's birth. Remember that the Caesars, like the pharaohs and other rulers, also claimed their own lineage back to the gods. So you've not just got a world full of gods sitting on Mount Olympus or up in the clouds and all the rest of it. You've got humans in ruling authority claiming to show their lineage back to the gods as well. And here's where the problem comes, okay? I'm building this picture because it's important that you understand the worldview, and then you can look at Paul's writings and what he was facing and what he was trying to deal with. The Hebrew or the Jewish faith, and I'm calling it that despite that latterly it's come to be known as Christianity, remember it was a Judaism of form in the first century, was monotheistic and considered all other gods with a small g not gods at all. That's a problem. Every other culture you can absorb, you can sit all the other gods side by side at some great big dining table, but not for the Jews. And not then for the Gentile converts to this new faith. So this is a direct challenge to the religion of Rome as it happened at that time. The only saving grace for the Jews, I say saving grace is a partial saving grace, is the fact that the distinct ethnic identity of Jews made them a little more acceptable of themselves. Because they were a people, a specific ethnic group, they could be identified and labelled, I suppose you might say. And Jews themselves had actually been a part of Roman society since about 168 BC. And I'll explain how Jews came to Rome when we go to the Jewish courses tomorrow. The issue, of course, then, conversion, as a Gentile converting to this Judeo-Christian faith, was seen as critical of Roman life, critical of the Roman sovereign, the emperor, the Caesar. I said that you need to remember that the emperors considered themselves divine, so converts were perceived as un-Roman. And this had profound consequences for them personally, socially, politically, and economically. Because in order to worship this other god, they literally had to reject the practices that were at the heart of life in the Roman-controlled world. They couldn't go and hang out with their families because they'd be eating meat sacrificed to idols. All of what they were used to celebrating as holy days, as national gatherings, as fun times, as parties, all were attributed as worship to other gods. So they literally had to step out. They became, the ecclesia, they were the called out ones. They became this set apart individuals. Holiness has a cost to it, folks. We don't like to accept that, but holiness has a cost to it. Conversion meant rejection of family and country, preferring Israel's God and Israel's land. Because it's not just a case of a particular god. Land was associated and rivers was associated with particular deities as well. So Rome suddenly wasn't the promised land. It wasn't the eternal city. Israel and Jerusalem was. And again, this is an affront to the Roman authorities, and not just the authorities, the whole culture, the whole population. Because by them going this way, it basically says that everybody else who's not doing that is wrong. And nobody likes to be told that, do they? The other aspect to this, and I'll conclude here, The other aspect to this is that rituals were exclusive in Christianity. By their very nature, they were exclusive because they couldn't be inclusive because of the nature of what was believed. Rituals were exclusive, rejecting of many of the pagan worship practices. As such, Christians were perceived as secretive and treated with suspicion. Rumours of cannibalism and incest spread due to the concept of eating the body and blood of the Messiah and reference to one another as brother and sister. Interesting, eh? In many ways, the Judeo-Christian faith, and again, Christianity, we've got to get away from a modern-day concept of Christianity, but the Judeo-Christian faith was the opposite of Roman religion. Okay? So I'm building the picture for you, I'm building the context, and hopefully as we step through this, there's more to this. This is one extended teaching, you could say. Hopefully the piece of the jigsaw puzzle will start to slot into place as we read some of Paul's stuff.